Hi, I'm Zach Mayberry, and I am here with Dr. Runnels. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Daniel Runnels. I teach here at the University of Central Missouri, mostly about Latin America. I teach some Spanish language courses as well. Also affiliated with Gender and Sexuality Studies program and a couple other units on campus, but mostly I do kind of Latin American literature, culture, philosophy sorts of topics.
All right. And today we'll be talking about racial justice in America. Can you give me some of your background on that?
On racial justice
Yes.
topics. We'll certainly have like teaching and research interests in these kinds of things from academic kind of vantage point. I've published some research on, for example, like popular revolts, both here in the United States with the 2020 Black Lives Matter uprising, kind of putting that into conversation with some revolts in some other Latin American contexts that I have studied. Like for example, in 2019, there was a revolt in Chile, and I've got some work out about the two of those. The one in Chile is less kind of focused on racial justice, but certainly putting it into context and into discussion with the Black Lives Matter uprising, which was very obviously about that. So, as in terms of intellectual, I teach about kind of racial diversity and racial difference in different contexts, both in gender sexuality studies courses, but also in Latin America, where in some cases it can be a little bit more complicated than we have here in our United States contexts. So certainly have these various kind of intellectual academic interests in it. At the same time, I'm also a person who lives in the world and experiences and views the world outside of my job here at the university. So with keen interest and like you know a pursuit of justice, like I think a lot of us have. So I guess I would characterize it as two things: when I've got certain intellectual interest, kind of the academic work that I do in both research and teaching, but also of course, as a person who is a citizen of this country and of the world, also constantly thinking about these things.
And how would you describe the current state of racial equality and justice in America, with the Supreme Court rolling back things like affirmative action and the removal of DEI programs? Walmart themselves has just announced that they're rolling back their program on that. How do you see that sort of thing affecting going forward?
Yeah. I would say that it seems pretty rough out there, I guess. I mean, there's no doubt that over the history of the United States, for example, right, if we could do a long kind of look at the trajectory of movements towards racial justice, I mean, there's no doubt that like there have been important advances made, and some, in some important regards, things are better than they were at different times throughout our history. At the same time, there are some troubling moves, like you were suggesting, right? Um, the moves against affirmative action, but also state legislatures around the country that are, in some cases, kind of, I think, without good reason, targeting targeting DEI policies at universities and other sorts of public institutions. I think in many cases without a real clear understanding of what is at stake with DEI sorts of policies and workshops at institutions. But so the thing that I think is troubling is that there's a lot of energy against those sorts of things on the political right, for example, right now in the country, and in some ways it kind of feels like they're winning, which is troublesome for those of us who are kind of on the other side of the political spectrum, I'd say.
It seems as though a lot of people who do fight against racial justice movements seem to believe that either racism no longer exists due to legal protections that exist, but we see all the time where that is not true, especially with the rates of incarceration
Mm-hmm.
and killings of Black people,
Mm-hmm.
like the sort of movements that Black Lives Matter protests against.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and particularly in college campuses, I would
Mm-hmm.
say there's a lot of activism that is pro racial justice.
Mm-hmm.
Between 2010 and 2015, about
Mm-hmm.
55% of all social movements on campuses were race based.
Okay.
What do you think is the reason behind the? What do you think the reason behind the belief that racism in America just doesn't exist to those people?
I mean, there's probably all sorts of factors that can go into this, and you could, I don't know, maybe a sociologist would have an answer, a historian would have a different answer, and a cultural studies person would have an answer, and an anthropologist would have it. Maybe there's various ways that you could kind of come to this. I mean, one thing that I think is probably at least part of the conversation about this is that people don't like to be called racist, right? To make the claim that something is a racist policy or that something is a continuation of racially unjust legacies from history or whatever it might be, or to blatantly and explicitly call out a person or a group or institution or policy or law or whatever as a racist thing, that's something that people have strong reactions to. And there's probably potential explanations for why people have such strong reactions to that. Is that answering your question? I mean, people have like kind of real strong, I would say, affective response to it. There's a real emotional charge to that. And that puts up a lot of barriers, I think, to conversations that are honest and open about racial inequalities and these types of things in spaces that people would like to believe are kind of post-racial. Maybe this is kind of coming on the heels of something like the presidency of Barack Obama, where there was discussion publicly about the specter of a post-racial society, and I think we're seeing clearly now that that's very much not the case. But for a certain segment of maybe the population, the idea of being a post-racial society is still kind of appealing, and people want to hang on to that. And so when you say then on the heels of that something is racist or that there is a problem with this or that in terms of racial inequality, that really hits people in a way that I think people are not ready for. People are uncomfortable with, I would say.
Yeah, that does make absolute sense to me. And yeah, I would say if you're asking different professionals what their opinion on it, they are going to probably have varying opinions. Something that I think I had noticed whenever I was doing some research on this, it seems as though whenever people hear about programs like affirmative action, they believe that themselves as a white person is being disenfranchised because they're not being given that benefit, except they are already benefiting just from the fact of being born a white person.
Right.
But no one wants to believe that they're just inborn with benefits. Like you want to believe that they've worked for that. Because we live in we want to believe we live in a meritocracy.
Right.
But that's obviously not the case for a lot of people, because there are racist people who exist and put down other races. And that's why programs like affirmative action are important to counteract those kinds of people.
Yeah, part of this, I mean, part of what you just said made me think, there's the idea of something existing that would be called white privilege is also, like you kind of just said, that's a troublesome thing for some people to kind of latch onto and understand as a concept that describes part of our world and some of the people that live in the world. People that have strong reactions against the idea of something like white privilege, a response to that would be something like, oh, well, my life is hard and I'm a white person, or I have this barrier and things are not easy for me just because I'm white, which I think would be kind of is a misunderstanding of what white privilege is, right? White privilege, when the thing that people misunderstand is they think that the term is signaling that life is easy for white people, and that's simply not what it signals. It signals precisely that your whiteness is not something that is a barrier to your flourishing or your potential for success or potential for access to institutions and healthcare and all sorts of different things. But the term itself kind of gets pushed and pulled in various directions. And when one person says something like white privilege, they mean one thing. And when someone else says something, so there's like a linguistic maybe disagreement involved with some of these terms about that, even just like labels, whiteness, blackness, racism, inequality, equality, these terms get pushed and pulled. And maybe this is me, like the literature and language scholar coming out, is that even just the terminology itself, just by the fact that words always do get pushed and pulled, these are terms that we don't even have in every case like a common maybe agreement on what we're talking about, right? Which makes the discussion of movements towards racial equality all the more difficult, I would say.
I would say that linguistically, the word privilege itself is problematic with the way that people think about it, because you hear privilege and you just assume that means that you're being upheld in some way, where in reality, as you had said, it's just not preventing you. Where that's where I was discussing programs like affirmative action, because that sort of fights back against where people are being prevented, like from succeeding due to their race. Because while people don't like to describe themselves as racist or think that they're racist, that inborn racism does exist for a lot of people, and it does cause barriers for other people.
Well, I'm not sure. I largely subscribe to that. I'm not sure I would call it inborn racism. I would maybe just kind of qualify that, and I would say that this stuff is kind of baked into the cake from early on. It's not that, I don't think, and maybe we need anthropologists for this, maybe we need psychologists for this. I don't think anyone would say that people are born racist, but the thing is that this stuff gets kind of baked in from all sorts of different angles from a very early age, and sometimes in very subtle ways that kind of build upon each other, and racism is then created in ways that don't always have like a singularly and easily identifiable locus of enunciation, I guess I would say. That just makes it tough. It makes it tough to have conversations about these things with people who are pretty invested in kind of rejecting the term or something like that.
And a lot of those are systemic issues, but another thing that I did want to discuss would be issues such as the Stop Asian Hate movement, because those seemed less about systemic issues that stem from the racist creation of like America and just policies and whatnot. That seemed more targeted hate due to a situation.
And you mean like the pandemic? Is that what you're referring to, right? The fact that the pandemic, the virus emerged from China, and so that the Asian people kind of got lumped into this big category as like maybe being worthy of hatred of some sort. Is that what you're referring to? Yeah, I mean, I think that's that sounds about right to me. My understanding of the little kind of catchphrase that you put, "Stop Asian Hate," I might be wrong, but that's my understanding, is that as a kind of slogan, like as a mediator for this kind of political movement, has really just emerged in the past handful of years. I mean, of course, there's been movements for racial justice for Asian peoples, for Asian descendant peoples and immigrants and things from long before that. But of course, my understanding is that the phrase itself and this kind of current iteration of it really basically started in 2020. Is that what you understand as well?
From my research, that's about where it started, yes.
Yeah.
And kind of moving back to the Black Lives Matter movement, as far as sort of criminal justice in the issues with the incarceration of Black people, because I believe the ratio of incarcerated people by race is 8-1 compared from Black people to white people. What sort of changes do you believe would need to come about in order to sort of fix those issues?
Well, I mean, I'm not a criminal justice scholar. I'm not a legal scholar or anything. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, so this question, I'll kind of roundabout way to kind of get to this answer. Your question, you're reminding me of, I don't know, are you familiar with in Montgomery, Alabama, there's a really great museum and kind of public space there. It's about race and, the legacies of slavery and reconciliation. It's really great, like kind of haunting public monument there about legacies of slavery in the South, but then also like just down the street, there's a museum that's about precisely mass incarceration. I could find the name of this place. It's escaping me at the moment. But basically the narrative of this public monument and museum is precisely one of continuity between legacies of slavery and current manifestation of state racism as it plays out in mass incarceration. So precisely what you're talking about. The first thing is that I view it at least precisely as like a continuation with a new form, which it sounds like what your question is suggesting as well, right?
Yes.
So in terms of like what needs to happen to get beyond this, I mean that's a monster question. I mean there are some simple things that like here and there, various states around the country seem to be doing that kind of are aimed towards rectifying some past injustice, things like reforms about recreational drugs and things, right? Because you probably know the statistics better than I do. My understanding is that rates of incarceration for having possession of small amounts of marijuana or other types of drugs are significantly higher for Black people than they are for white people, even though across that racial line, people tend to use these drugs at similar rates. Does that sound correct to you?
Yes.
That's my understanding, that the usage rates are relatively equal, but that the incarceration rates are dramatically unequal. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, as far as I am aware, the rates of incarceration for drug offenses is highly disproportional despite usage rates.
Right. And so there have been states around the country, and interestingly enough, Missouri, where we live, is one of them. A couple of years ago, when we legalized recreational marijuana, there are states that have kind of bounded those movements towards, or decriminalization, I guess, it's decriminalization of small amounts of these drugs. They have kind of combined that to, using maybe the tax revenue that is kind of garnered by businesses popping up that sell these products, to invest then in racial justice initiatives, or maybe using some of those monies for schools in areas that need more funding, resources for schools, that kind of stuff. At the same time, and there are also, I think, cases where states and different municipalities, local levels, have made some moves to change their policies about drug use, but then not rectified any of the people who are currently sitting in jail for having committed these offenses, for example, which that seems like an easy one to me. I mean, that maybe this is not a mass, mass kind of culture shift sort of thing, but it is the case, I think, that there are people sitting in jail currently at various places around the country for having possessed small amounts of marijuana or something in states where it is now legal to do so. So something like, we just need to let those people out of prison, seems to me like a pretty easy one as a start, right? That's not going to change or just solve problems of access to education or access to healthcare, access to, financial institutions. That's not a panacea that's going to fix everything. But that's a pretty easy one. I think that could be a start. Some states do that. Some states have not done that. That's maybe a unanswer to your question in terms of what would be like a concrete sort of policy thing that could be implemented. Is that kind of what you're thinking of?
Yes, and sort of moving on from there, but I guess also sort of related. What do you believe are the main issues facing social movements today?
One, I think, would be that being an activist, engaging in public protest, public manifestations, public activist work is very tiring. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources, and people have limited time, and people have limited resources, and people have limited energy, and people have family responsibilities and health responsibilities, and I guess what I'm kind of pointing to is that you don't have to talk to very many activists out there in the world to get a sense that activist burnout basically is a real thing, right? The threats to various racial justice movements or economic justice movements or gender-based, movements against gender-based violence or whatever it might be, the threats to those types of movements for equality are numerous, and in many cases they are energetic, and they are sometimes well-funded, and sometimes they have institutional backing. And pushing back against those types of threats to a cause that you believe in, I think can be very draining. It can be very tiring and maybe demoralizing, and it would be, it takes kind of a heroic effort to keep that kind of effort going. And that's not something that a lot of people or I would say that's not something that kind of the conditions of our current world allow for a lot of people to be cut out for, right? People might want to invest time and energy in activism, but they also have to go to work. They might have to work 2 jobs, right? They have to find a way for their child to get to childcare, or they have to care for an elderly family member, or whatever it could be. Maybe they've got a 45-minute commute to get to their job, or whatever it might be. The conditions of contemporary life for a lot of people who might otherwise be interested in activist kind of policy or activist kind of spaces. The conditions of life make it very difficult for people to do that in a sustained way. I think that's why, in part, for like 2020, we talked about the Black Lives Matter uprising a few different times. The 2020 uprising was, I think, the biggest like kind of national uprising maybe ever. The estimates for the number of people that were out in the streets, all across the country, all across the world, really. There are, of course, various factors for why that moment was as big as it was. There's lots of explanations for why that could have been, but it was huge. But it just does remain the case that it didn't last, right? I mean, it was a relatively isolated moment in time. We don't have that mass movement today, right? And I think, so if the question is like, what's a challenge? I think like a principal challenge is precisely that life is hard and activist work is really challenging and tiring, and people deserve to take breaks, I guess, would be part of the mix. Does that answer your
Yes, and I
question a
can
bit?
absolutely understand that. Having been trying to get involved myself, it is very time consuming and rather exhausting.
Yeah.
But I guess besides that, would you have any suggestions for anyone who is trying to get involved with activism?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I guess, so the other side of this coin then, if given the fact that activist work is tiring and difficult and takes energy, I mean, I think like the suggestion would have to be that activist work is done in community, right? I mean, people should not feel expected to do like a Herculean effort on their own, right? The forces that push back against various activist efforts are collective and need a collective response, I would say. We have this kind of myth in the contemporary world about, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, or the single person who can kind of break through all the noise. And of course, those stories are out there, and they can be very inspiring. Those types of, when we see people that have success and do that and break through the systematic kind of collective noise or whatever. But that's not the case for most people, right? So in terms of a response to the potential burnout of activists, I think the answer to that has to be that any organizing efforts need to be collective and to be broad. I think that activists would do well to seek out connections with other types of activist groups, as opposed to kind of atomizing themselves and saying, well, our issue is this and your issue is that, and then their issue is this other one, and then this other group's issue is this. I think the atomization of activist kind of priorities could be a stumbling block to the potential for greater collaboration across different types of issues. And so not only, I would say, maybe to wrap this up, I think not only just to whatever issue you're interested in, not just find a collectivity that can do the work all together, but then kind of collectivize that collectivity already, right? So to seek kind of consensus across issues, as opposed to kind of breaking off into small atoms, because like the atomization of activist work makes it, I think, easier for the various forces that want to keep activists down. It makes it easier for them to keep them down, I would say.
All right. Well, this has been Zach Mayberry with Dr. Dr. Daniel Runnels. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.